Welcome everyone to Work 2.0 podcast. Today we have with us a very interesting guest. So very few times in our journey we got to talk to some impeccable transformational leader who's not really just talking the talk, who has walked the walks. And today we have such leaders. So Robert Greifeld, he's a chairman of Virtue Financials Inc. He previously served as chairman of the board of directors of the Nasdaq Stock Market LLC until May 10, 2017, and as the Chief Executive Officer of NASDAQ from 2003 to 2016. During his tenure, Mr. Greifel led NASDAQ through a series of complex, innovative acquisitions that extended the company's footprint from a single US equity exchange to a global exchange and technology solution provider, nearly quadrupling revenue, growing annual operating profits by more than 24 times, and achieving a market value of over $11 billion. Mr. Greifel is a member of Economic Club of New York and NYU Stern Board of Overseers. He is a founder and chairman of the USA Track and Field Foundation, which supports emerging athletes and inner city youth athletics. Mr. Greifel holds a Master's of Business from NYU Stern and BA in English from Iona College. With that, Robert, welcome to the podcast.
It is my pleasure to be here, and please call me Bob.
Yes, Bob. So, firstly, to our friends and listeners and viewers, this is the book. And Bob, before I get into this, thank you so much. Very few times, we, at least our entrepreneur side of our brain, always crave for some experience from someone who is going through a transformation of a large corporation and going in at a personal level, talking about what goes in their mind and around them, and walking us through that. So, thank you so much for this journey. I do appreciate that.
Well, I thank you for the kind words.
So, before we jump in, love to hear about your journey. Like, what brought you to Nasdaq? Like, what's the fabric of a leader that was able to pull Nasdaq out of this mess?
Well, I would say this. My journey to NASDAQ was not the standard journey that existed back in 2003. Typically, to head an exchange was a sinecure appointment as you got to the end of your career. And it came from somebody who came from an investment banking background. I had none of those backgrounds to me, and I certainly didn't have the age at that point in time. I had been a software entrepreneur for 10 years. And the product we built was a trading system for NASDAQ market makers. So I had the in-depth knowledge of what the NASDAQ market was about. And I had the entrepreneurial chops, having built a company and then sold it in 1999 to SunGard Data Systems. And I was fortunate with all that background to have on the board of directors of NASDAQ private equity firms from Silicon Valley who recognized when you stripped away the license of NASDAQ, it really was a technology transaction processing company that needed somebody like myself to lead it.
Interesting. And I think one thing I was wondering about when I was reading this book is how has your childhood has helped you shape to become the person and take those risks and bold moves. Walk us through some of your childhood journey if you can. That has really helped you become what you are.
Well, that's going back a long, long way. But I would say fundamental to my success is I was raised in a lower middle class environment. My dad worked for the post office. We had 5 children. He always had to have 2 jobs. So we understood cleanly the value of work and the value of really using your resources, your money in a wise way. And I always remember back to my mom in particular saying, you can do everything you want in life, which seemed nonsensical at the time. But I realize now that guided me through different phases of my professional development.
Interesting. And so let's talk about sort of the NASDAQ days, right? So when you are given this baton to sort of run such a ginormous US equity company, and you are, as you said, you are a industry outsider in some perspective. You have a software background, now coming to this hardcore financial services company. How do you grapple with that fact? Like, what are some of the things that you end up doing to prepare yourself to steer the ship?
So it's interesting. So I would say this: I came in there having been an outsider and knowing exactly what the challenges were with respect to the technology and the transaction processing business. So as I cover in the book, I came in there day one, and before 8 o'clock in the morning, asked two of the senior managers who worked directly for the CEO that it was time for them to move on. And I wanted to make sure that I communicated directly to all employees that there was a new sheriff in town. We're going to do things in a new and different way. I knew before I started that everybody was prepared to get involved with discussions of how they did it currently and why that was the right way to do it. I did not believe we had the time for those kind of internal monologues, internal dialogues. And so I wanted to change the culture then and there. It was not a piece of things that I wanted to negotiate. And so I think that's not the right management style over a long period of time. But when you're in a crisis situation, you have to operate in that mode. So I did that. So I had a very clear view of what I wanted to do on the technology side, on the transaction side, having lived that. What was interesting is when I came to NASDAQ, I realized I knew nothing with respect to the publicity aspect of being a CEO of NASDAQ. I knew nothing about the government relations aspect of being the CEO of NASDAQ, nor did I understand the necessity of having personal relationships with the various CEOs listed with your company, and your brand was tied to that. So while I was confident in terms of what I had to do, I also then, really learned a lot in those first, 6 months.
Interesting. And I think one thing that was pretty stuck to me when I was reading the book was, so you had this two ideologies. So one is one sort of you were talking about that direction is important, and pace may not be that relevant. You know, that if you're doing the right direction, you will eventually get there. Things takes their own time. And the other aspect is, say, something like, say, if Nasdaq is sinking, or it's not going in the direction it's going. How do you grapple these two facts together? So it's a big enough company that it will take, things are really really slow when it comes to transforming an organization, and on the other side, things takes time. How do you, as a captain of that ship, sort of bring these two thoughts together, that I need to act quickly, and I know whatever I act, it will take probably some time. And so how do you grapple the fact between these two sort of diverging thoughts?
Well, a good and complicated question. So let me start by saying why you're essentially scared to death as you're going through this radical transformation. Because I live with the fundamental thought that success is not preordained, nor is failure. And the difference between success and failure are two sides of a very thin dime. So you have to then execute, work hard every day to be on the right side of that thin dime. Right. So when I'm there in the first year, I'm not going to work in the morning or going home at night saying, okay, this thing is guaranteed. Right. I always said, I don't have a magic wand. I know what we have to do. We're going to do it. We're going to execute as quickly as we can. And we're still not sure what's going to come out the other end. And so this was not like the imperial CEO confident in everything. You might project more that image, but you still know that nothing is assured in life. So with respect to directly answer your question, the timing, obviously things take time. Your job is to compress that cycle of time frame and innovation. So I came to NASDAQ, you only had one way of communicating to the market, and then the rest of the world wanted to communicate in a different way. And, it took us 6 months to get there. In that 6 months, it was painful because I know I needed it yesterday, but you had to be patient because all you can do is do what you can do and do it well. But it also ties back to what I have said all along, and I learned this through the years at Nasdaq. I met so many CEOs, right, more than anybody, really, in a way. And when you meet and talk to these CEOs, they're very smart and they're very hardworking. But yet, I see many of them fail. And I said, well, why are they failing? And it's very apparent they fail because they don't choose the right things to work on, right? You always have to choose the things that have the biggest lever in terms of leveraging your time to be effective. So when you're there and your things, the smoke, fog of war is up, you got to make sure you're choosing the right things. And also, what's very difficult is you have to choose the things you're not going to do well, right?
Mm.
That is very hard, right? Because these CEOs, they're success driven, type A. They want to do everything well. They want to be the best at everything. You don't have enough time in the day to be the best at everything. You have to choose to be the best in the things that are fundamentally important, or really just fundamental to to your business, where you fail if you don't do these things well. So that's what I thought. All right, what do I have to do well? Right, what is absolutely imperative that do well, that's on that critical success path.
We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast. Interesting. And like looking inside, like when you are going, say, in Nasdaq and looking outside into something like this organization, which the market is shifting, and you know that something needs to be done to sort of help these companies steer out. If you look at say other CEOs, as you were saying, who are just about to take control of a company that is seeking desperate transformations, right? So what would be your suggestions and thoughts to those leaders who are going, like, looking outside in these challenges of transforming their own organization through sort of cultural change and this market condition change?
Yeah, so I would kind of summarize what we just spoke at in a way, right? So one is, you have to be assured of the path, right? So you're put there, and it's certainly better if you have the path in your mind. If you have to go on a listening tour and learn, uh, you know, when you're in crisis, you don't typically have that period of time. So the board
Mm.
really should hire somebody who can then hit the ground running. And when I interviewed for the job at NASDAQ, in the last interview, which I think got me over the line with respect to the offer, was I said, this is what I am going to do in the next 100 days, bullet point by bullet point. I'm coming here day one. I know what the plan is. So if you're a company in crisis and the incoming CEO doesn't have a plan and needs to go on a listening tour, I think that's a bad hire, from my perspective. So you've got to, one, have the plan. You obviously will have to modify the plan. And one of the things we talk about in the book is tied to what Jim Collins had in Good to Great. You have to get the right people on the bus, right? You cannot overemphasize that. And certainly when I believe in the plan, the 100-day plan, the 1 year strategic plan, the 3 to 5 year strategic plan, you've got to believe in that. But you have to understand that by definition, those plans will be wrong, and you will have
Mm.
to modify those plans, and you have to have the people on the bus have the ability to recognize that we have to evolve, we have to change. The reality we thought we were talking about 6 months, a year, 2 years ago is different than the current reality, and we have to respond to that. So you have to be clear of purpose, recognize that you'll be wrong. You're going to have to modify that. You have to have the right people, and certainly, when you have the right people, life gets fundamentally easier.
Interesting. And let's talk about, spend a few minutes on the right people, right? So what is your secret recipe to find the right people to engage when you're sort of taking a challenge?
So I would say this, I had a yardstick in my mind that 80% of the promotion should come from in-house,
Mm.
20% outside. The 80% inside is because those people, one, your success rate will be a lot higher, in that you basically have years to interview them. You get to see how they perform in different situations over time. They are part of the culture. They know how the culture works. No matter how good your interview process is, it's never as good as having somebody there that you go, no. So important to recognize. And I take great pride. Adina who's my successor, was there. Uncover the hidden gems. Now I say 80%, not 100%, because clearly you need to get fresh blood coming in
Mm.
also, right? You need to extend the culture. The culture, like anything else, has to evolve over time. And if you go 100%, then it'll become too inbred. You'll have a lack of new concepts coming in. You'll lack some, what I call positive discordance in the organization. But 80% is an overwhelming number of people. You do that, your success rate is very high with the 80%. And then, that ensures that you're having the right people on the bus.
Interesting.
Now, but
And
I should say, then when you want to do 80%, then you have to be able to train them, which we can talk about
mm,
separately, right? Because they're not ready to be in a position just automatically.
interesting. And so the time that when you joined Nasdaq, it's a very interesting time for at least the financial services company. Almost in a way, every company in the industry, they're going through this digital transformation keyword, and it was just emerging and getting into the live stream of these companies where they're trying to find digitization into the mainstream of businesses. And it must have been challenging for a company like Nasdaq, because it culturally it requires sort of a redefining how to do business and how to perceive market and how to sort of appreciate market. So how do you like ensure that the company is transforming with the pace that's required for it to grow?
So, one is I talk about you can ensure it by mandating it as the autocratic CEO.
Hmm.
And at times that is the right answer. Most of the times it's not, but at times it's the right answer. The second is you can ensure it by making sure that you have the people who know that they have to steer the bus, and the bus will have to go in different directions there, and that is the culture. What is right today will not be right tomorrow. I remember
Hmm.
saying that many times. So you have to have that attitude, right? Because we were successful doing this yesterday, in certain ways, guarantees us we won't be successful doing it tomorrow. And the other thing I say, which I do mention in the book, is once you achieve competency, you have to battle complacency, right? So we had
Hmm.
to have that in the organization, right? You have to battle complacency. And this is not extreme where you have this high performer who then one day comes in and just kind of mails in results and operating at 50% of his capacity, his or her capacity. It's a lot more subtle than that. You go from somebody who's really hard charging 100% producer, now they're at 92%, right?
Hmm.
So 92% sounds not bad, or 94%. But as I said, the difference between success and failure are two sides of a thin dime, right? And the 100% person could be the succeed. The 92% person could be the person who fails. So you have to have that culture recognizing that's there. And I remember one time somebody said to me, list your top accomplishments at NASDAQ. You've been there 8, 10 years. And I said, if I start sitting around talking about that, then I would hope the board would say, let's get a new CEO in here. So
Hmm.
in a way, when I talk about complacency, it gets easier, not just with competency, but when you have something to talk about what you achieved there. And as it went on in my career, I would always say, okay, I have to make sure, I'm keeping these words true to myself. And would Bob, the shareholder, be happy with the mental state of Bob, the CEO? And as you make a decision that's
Hmm.
time to move on, that is something that factors in to your decision. I'm a shareholder here, and I've got this CEO here who's been doing a great job for the last 10 or 12 years, but that doesn't matter when he comes to work in January the 1st. Is that person as hungry as they were a decade ago? Or are they really just having a creeping complacency coming into their day-to-day life?
Interesting. So, I think last month I was talking to one of the CEO of Fortune 100 company, and he was telling me how being a CEO is, so CEO is an ecosystem. It's not a person, right? So you bring in sort of that infrastructure that enable the company to think the way thinking. So from your perspective, like what are sort of your recipe of success? Like what is your ecosystem that really helped you um, like transform company like Nasdaq? Like how do you, who are your key people, or the ingredients of key people that helps and empower you to makes right decision, as you rightly said, that and sort of in the right direction.
Right. So what you're getting at is a couple ways to think about it. You have people who have great content knowledge, great IP about their chosen responsibility, right? And that's certainly a necessary ingredient, but by itself is not sufficient. Or then you have hyper bright, hyper motivated people who don't know the
Mhm.
particular space, but will dive in and learn it, quite intensely. So somewhere in a witch's brew mix of those two skill sets. So point, you have great athletes given a position that they
Mhm.
will then grow into with respect to the particular domain expertise, IP related to that position. And other times you just say, okay, I have this content expert. They might not be a great manager. They might not be the person who's going to run through every wall, but their insight and wisdom on these topics, really are what predominates. So I would say that the former is something I would value slightly higher than the latter, and certainly over time, maybe not in a given moment for time. So what answering your question, you have to then, and we keep going to come back to the right people.
Mhm.
They have to be the
Mhm.
culture carriers, and they have to be persistent. I remember back in the time when I used to read a lot of business books. Uh, and there was one of the early books on Bill Gates, and I was reading that as a relatively young man. And in the book, he said he never succeeded at what he attempted the first time
Mhm.
he attempted it, and it was always the persistence. And I said, well, if Bill Gates doesn't succeed the first time, then what chances
Mhm.
do I have? And what's the lesson here? So that stayed with me. So when you look at the character of the people you want on the team, it has to be that character of persistence, that the first defeat is only the first defeat, and you're going to carry on from there.
Interesting. And let's talk about some of the learning. So when Wall Street is going through its digital disruption, what were some of the learning that you observed as you were grooming Nasdaq through this digital disruption?
So one of the things we learned, which I think the rest of the industries will learn, is that we took what was job functions of people on the floor, which would be fairly sophisticated. And since it was entirely in the digital age and didn't have what I call today, manual dexterity requirements, we were able to put fairly complicated logic, right, with a
Mhm.
lot of conditional, a lot of if and conditions into code, right, where people had done this before. So when we look, nothing to do with my book or my experience, but when you certainly look at how industries will be transformed in the years and decades to come, we can look at what we accomplished on Wall Street and recognize that some relatively high IQ functions can, in fact, put into a AI or machine learning context. And the advantage we have is, since we're dealing with pure digitals, we didn't need the manual dexterity that a lot of human jobs have. And so when you look at the intelligence required in the AI systems, their bigger challenge is not that, but more about the manual dexterity living in the physical world. So we're able to reduce it to bits and bytes, and there was some very sophisticated code that we had to write to make this happen. Which is quite fun actually.
Interesting. And we'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast. I want your perspective on very sort of very interesting differences that we are seeing in the market right now. So there are two companies. So one say company like GE, or if you say company like say Netflix. So if GE miss out on a quarter, the market hammers the hell out of those, right? And if Netflix misses, so it's perceived in a different lens. So when you are, say, company like Nasdaq, like how would it perceive sort of these two different scenarios on a single index? Like how do you sort of bring the differences together and sort of create a single index out of this?
So what you would hear is people would say the public markets are short-term oriented, right? So I had to live
Mm,
through that through my whole career. And I would push back on them. And I would say, here, the facts are that if you present to your investors a certain thesis, right, and you stick to that thesis, the markets can have an incredibly long period of patience. And
mm,
in our industry, at NASDAQ, we won like 95% of the biotech companies that came to market. And
okay.
their average time frame to get an approval for a new drug
Mm,
was about a decade, right? And really, it was a little bit more than that. So, in that decade, investors had to believe. And investors obviously bought a tremendous amount of biotech stock in the time I was there. And they didn't pay attention to the quarter because they didn't
mm,
come there saying, I'm going to make these quarterly numbers. Now, if
mm,
they missed a approval from the FDA, then clearly the stock
mm,
had a problem. So if you are coming public saying this is our plan, right, and then investors self-select to buy into your plan by buying shares, then you do what you need to do. If investors buy into your plan because you're going to make quarterly numbers or have a certain revenue amount, you don't do it, you'll be penalized. So it's a matter of transparency and effectiveness of communications. The public investors, not just in biotech, but in Amazon, have shown a tremendous tolerance for businesses to grow over a period of time. And you mentioned Netflix, right? So
mm,
today, Netflix, I think if they didn't get the subscriber growth that
mm,
investors thought, maybe not the profitability,
mm.
then their stock will suffer, right? So they're going, they went from just a broad plan to really now it's about subscriber growth, and clearly it'll be about profitability in the not too distant future.
Interesting. And I think couple of months back, I was talking to Tim O'Reilly about sort of this idea of that the fiduciary responsibility of a CEO towards the stake shareholder versus now going to sort of it's no longer to at least getting the profitability, but at least as you're rightly saying, subscriber base and some other dynamics. So, from your vantage point, you having observed this industry for quite many years, how are you seeing the the role of a shareholder changing when it comes to the impact of any company has when it's in a stock market? Like, is it so are the companies now sort of focusing more on the employees, or they are still sort of fiduciary responsible to give out churn out profits every time to the shareholders? Like, what's your perception?
Well, it depends, right? So clearly, I think the end state of valuation is going to be about your discounted cash flow, right?
Hmm,
So forget even your accounting
hmm,
earnings, right? You're
hmm,
going to value this enterprise over the long term on what kind of cash it's generating. So that is the black hole that everybody gets sucked into, and investors have to believe in. So investors, when they want to invest in an early stage company that's not profitable, they're
hmm,
doing that because they have models and belief that in time this business will be very profitable. And
hmm,
when you're a pure technology company where marginal cost against the marginal dollar revenue can be quite low, then
hmm,
people will be willing to take that bet for a period of time. So I think that's just a fact of life that
hmm,
nothing will change. We'll have certain standard deviations away from that different during different times in the market and the market cycle, but you're going to land up back in that situation. So what you're bringing up, though, in addition to driving towards those financial goals, do the CEOs have responsibilities beyond the shareholders to stakeholders, right? So my feeling on this, and I've written on this, is that if you are concerned about the delivering results to the shareholders, you will always act in your enlightened self-image,
hmm,
self-interest, right?
hmm,
And that means that you will have to pay attention to stakeholders, right? Because you operate in the environment you operate in. And I think that's fundamental. So the fact is, CEOs, would be stupid to just try to worry about the given quarter and not worry about anything else. So I think,
Hmm.
it's more wordsmithing rather than anything else in terms of what CEOs are doing.
Interesting. And another perspective I want your perspective on is the future of work, right? So right now, because of automation, we are seeing like almost every business right now, or at least many, like we are in talks with many governments on their sort of anxiety there of losing out on tax dollar, because if their main source of revenue is people employed and paying taxes, right? So if automation is sort of not displacing workforce, and they're not trained in fast enough, then obviously they will lose out on the tax collections. So how is, from your vantage point, how are, like, what's your take on that? Like, what would you see, what are you seeing the future companies or the companies, how would they resolve this? Like, would be living in a company that's completely automatable, or like what's your take on that?
So I would say this, that right now I have a feeling that the pace of change with respect to machine learning, artificial intelligence, natural language is going to accelerate quite dramatically in the next 10 years. And this will have a material impact on the nature of work and the opportunities for employment.
Hmm.
I also am keenly aware that if I had said this for each of the last 50 years, right, these exact words, I would have been wrong, right?
Hmm.
So the Luddites have been predicting the fact that technology change will eviscerate work as we know it for a long period of time. And we're sitting here with, you know, a 50-year low in unemployment. So,
Hmm.
in fact, in spite of those facts, I still think that we certainly have a situation where the pace of technology change will be massive, right? And the robots are coming is another thing, that I'm saying in some form or fashion. So I think society will have to deal with that, and certainly whether that dealing with it is what I call taxing the robots in some way, we'll have to deal with that. So I believe that. But like I say, caution my belief because I would have been wrong for the last 50 years, right? People for the last 50 years protect, thinking that we're going to have massive unemployment because of all the automation that's happened. But we've seen the nature of work change, and most of the jobs that exist today did not exist 50 years ago. So you get those two thoughts, right? The world will change, but we'll adapt to it and there'll be a new nature of work. Or the other world is the world will change so quickly that we'll live in a period of time where the machines are doing everything and people are not left with a lot to do.
Interesting. And your take on sort of building the next leaders, right? So what is your secret recipe of building your successor? Like, how do you end up, like, how do you empower the new and emerging leaders, and how do you prepare them? What's your, if you can walk us through that process?
Sure. Well, certainly when you're saying you want to hire 80% from within,
Hmm.
it's fundamental that you have the ability to train these folks. So let's start before, just the leaders. But when you think about yourself as a young person today, is I like to say you need technical training. The
Hmm.
world is not going to get less technical, right? 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, the world will not be less technical. It'll be more technical. So when I got my MBA, which I went at night for, I
Hmm.
majored in computer applications and information systems, they called it that. And I'd been in English undergrad. So I had all the basic,
Hmm.
finance economics courses. But the fact that I spent most of my time in the computer age, was fundamental to me. And I think with all this, it's not saying you need to be a computer scientist, but you have to have enough background knowledge to learn. And I think about my career, I think the MBA from NYU is fundamental. As an English undergrad, I learned a lot, but to have the basics of accounting, economics, finance, and more on the computer side, that allowed me to learn, right? It's not like you're learning ended, it allowed me to start the learning, because once you get into the job environment, you have to make sure that you are definitely a beneficiary of continuing education and to seek it out.
Interesting. So now let's spend a few minutes on the book. So
Right.
why write this book? Like, what's the premise behind this book?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. I don't know. So one, obviously, I would not write a book like that until I was gone from NASDAQ, because I said I don't want to be reflecting back. So it was a time to reflect back. When you think of the era that I served in, I started in 2003. The dot-com bubble had just burst, right? We were living in the aftermath of that. We had some difficult times. Then the world changed, and I think that Mark was, during the Google IPO, we said we went to a tailwind environment. We went right to the credit crisis after that, where we went to a deep freeze and the Great Recession there, and you had to then build from there and diversify your business model. So we saw a lot of interesting things, overlaid by technology, regulatory changes. I thought there was some interest for people. Right, there's some good stories in the book. I saw the Wall Street Journal said I was a wry storyteller, whatever that means. I'll take it as a compliment. So there's good, good historical backdrop. There's good stories. There's good management lessons that I thought would be interesting for people.
Interesting. We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast. And by the way, I love sort of how you close every chapter with very concise management. I think this is beautiful. What's a leadership lesson learned and all. I think
Right.
that's a nice way to close out on a thought. So, thank you for that. So I think so. When we talk to who is the prospective reader? Like when you who do you wrote this book for? Like what's an ideal reader for this book?
Ideal reader for the book? Well, I think you have. I don't really know, but I would say this. I mean, anybody who has an interest in business, right? Because
Hmm.
it's fundamentally a business book. Anybody who wants to be titillated by stories of some of the big figures who have walked the planet here, whether it be Jeff Bezos or Steve Jobs, will be interested in the book. Anybody who wants to understand how a business can handle not just good times but bad times, because
Hmm.
that's we have a pretty good handle of that in the book. We're very clear. And anybody who wants to talk about, how do you take a company that's really a single product company, meaning a U.S. equity exchange, and turn that into a global multi-asset, multi-business kind of corporation, and the steps you take along that way, I think we'll find that pretty interesting.
Interesting. So when we talk to the authors, some of them they say that some of the books that inspired their work. So do you have say sort of book that you took inspiration from while writing this book?
I would say not, but I would say on the book, as an English major, there are hidden Bob Dylan, Jack Kerouac references in there. So I encourage people to find them. And, in the book, I do talk obviously about Jim Collins' Good to Great. We use that
Hmm.
as a semi guidepost as we built the organization. As you read, I've obviously been a big consumer of the books of the leading figures in the Nasdaq marketplace, whether it be Steve Jobs or Bill Gates or people uh, uh, like that. But it's interesting. And getting into a topic is how do you get to be a good leader and how do you get to make good decisions? And that doesn't mean
Hmm.
you have to be the CEO by any stretch of the imagination. It could be in your personal life. It could be in your charitable giving. So, to me, I think you got to increase the denominator of your knowledge, right? So
Hmm.
and this is where I think sitting in a seat is important, because you increase your baseline knowledge. And I always do believe at the end of the day, you feel like your decisions are made at the gut level, but they're really not, right? Because you have that database in your head, right, of what you built up. You put your intelligent systems on top of it. I was going to say artificial intelligence, but since
Mm.
it's in your brain, it's not artificial. So you put your natural learning systems, your intelligent systems on it, and it creates a witch's brew, and that gives you the answer there. So when you talk about the denominator of knowledge, reading a book like mine helps with the denominator, and you should always be trying to, do that, and so you're in a position, to make the right decisions.
Interesting. And let's spend a few minutes on your journey, right? So, um, tell me, how do you spend your days today? Like, what do you do nowadays?
Well, I would say this. So I'm 62, and I reference in the book. If I knew I was going to live to 110, I would have still wanted to be the CEO of Nasdaq because I love
Mm.
the job. But I recognize that life is finite. I don't know if you knew that, but I'm telling you that for the first time. And the and the opportunity cost actually increases not on a linear basis, but an
Mm.
exponential basis as your number days decrease on a linear basis. So, I said one with NASDAQ, I realized that I was not as fundamental as I was in the beginning of the time there. The management team had matured. It was such a strong team led by Adina that I knew it could carry on. And I knew that by time at NASDAQ was becoming certainly not routine, but more routine. And I didn't feel like I was jumping off the cliff like I had been. So all these things came together. And the other thing is that when the kids are little, they're just
Mm.
always there, right? They meet your schedule. Now my kids are grown, and I have to start meeting their schedule and be available when they're available, which is fair. Turnaround is fair play. You also know that your parents are old, and you want to be there as you get to end of life. So all these things come in. But in no situation did I say I wanted to stop working. Right, I
Mm.
did want to have more time to give back, right? Because that takes
Mm.
time to do that. So where I do now is when I'm very comfortable, I am spending more time, effort, and money giving back,
Mm.
and giving back in ways that are important to me that I think can help others and society. And giving back is certainly to my kids and my parents, which is a fun thing. And on the work
Mm.
side, I always thought of myself as a entrepreneur. A It's called fintech now. It's a popular term. So I
Mm.
wanted to get back to my entrepreneurial roots. So I have a number of investments in fintech companies, of which I'm on the board of, and we're having a great time trying to conquer the world and be David again instead of Goliath. So fundamentally, I want to be David. So have a good time there.
Interesting, and thank you for walking us through that. So, if and we ask all of our guests to share, like, what are if we say, what are some of the qualities that has helped you become what you are, that really defines you? What are those qualities? Like, what would you attribute your success to? Which qualities?
All right. So the first thing I would say is, you know, I was very successful, and there's a price to pay, and it's not for everybody. And I covered it in the book. Don't expect to have, if you want to be hyper successful, don't expect to have a balanced life, right?
Mm.
The best you can hope to achieve is an integrated life, right?
Mm.
And where you integrate the family and business and it just
Mm.
works. But the balance doesn't happen, right? Because
Mm.
work, especially if you're a CEO, is a hard deal. And
Mm.
so this is not for everybody. And because somebody says, I don't want to be the CEO, there's a price to pay. I'd love to have the
Mm.
money the CEO makes, but there's a price to be paid. And you can be in different rings of the organization, have a great life, in certain ways, a better life than people are. So I never wanted to create the environment like this is what is the right answer for
Mm.
everybody there. And I also said to people who have said, how do I get to where you are? I would say, well, one is find a job that you love, right? That you
Mm.
bring passion to every day. Then you'll do that job well. You do that job well, you'll be recognized and other opportunities will present themselves. So I never
Mm.
had this career path in mind, but I did did things that I really had a great passion for. And then that creates its own false expectation. I said, well, it's important to recognize when you have a job you bring passion for, that doesn't mean when the alarm clock goes off on Monday morning, you're like, oh, great, finally I don't have to go on a weekend. I can get back to work, right? It's not that kind of thing, but it's still So I don't quite agree with Warren Buffett. You skip to work every day. That seems a little extreme to me. Uh, but you have to have a similar
Mm.
type of passion for it. And I think, as you can sense, I have a clear feeling that life is finite. And for you to spend a year, 2 or 3 years doing a job to check a box to get another, uh, point in the org chart, I think is just fundamentally wrong. I wouldn't do it. My career would never mean that much to me. I would never take career over life. You got to do the jobs that you want to do.
Interesting. So, and we ask all of our guests to like share some of their favorite reads, some of the books that has really helped. That has inspired them, and like, would you have some books that you could share with our listeners and viewers?
Yeah, well, first off, I want to tout my own book because it's pretty damn
Mm.
good. Not teasing you there, but one,
Yeah.
well done, well done. But I would say this. I'd break it down, obviously, in terms of books you read for reading pleasure, which also
Mm.
will give you certain insights. But on the business book side, I've always enjoyed the Jim Collins books,
Mm.
and I've enjoyed the. I thought the biography of Steve Jobs
Mm.
was, quite insightful in terms of what you could, learn from that. So I think when I think about different books, I tie back to my comment about you want to build that database of knowledge that you have, right? So
Mm.
most of it is going to be what you experience in the real world, but you have to then augment that by things you can read, because when somebody writes a book, if somebody's done this now, I mean, you have to distill a lot of information down, right? And so
Mm.
you're getting the essence of it. So when I read a good book, I recognize that it's the essence of knowledge that somebody gained over a long period of time. But it's never something you get like, okay, I learned so much from it. But it is building the database you can grow from. But obviously, when you read books for literature books for fun, then there's a lot you can learn about human nature from them also.
Interesting. And thank you for sharing that. And we are at the last end of the conversation, and it's the last
Right.
question, but not the least. So, if you want something our listeners and viewers to take away from this conversation, like if you want something that people should get that we have not covered in the conversation, and what would that be? Like, what would be your closing remark to our listeners and viewers?
Well, when I started with Nasdaq, its market cap was under $500 million. I left; it was over 13, and we grew ourselves from a single asset to this global organization. Uh, and when you look from the beginning to the end, you say, "Wow, that's hard." How would you do that? And the same thing with your career. You look from the beginning, and I started as a sales rep for Burroughs Corporation in 1979, and where I ended up. But I would say this, that in both situations, it was one logical step after the other, and the
Hmm.
next step built on the prior step, right? So you can do the 1,000-mile march a step at a time. There's no big leaps, right? It's one step, next step. So you want to be always building, have passion for what you're doing, building upon it in terms of your career and in terms of what you're doing in your day to day life.
With that, thank you so much, Bob, for sharing your time with us. Wish you nothing but success on this book, and thank you so much for doing your social work and dropping this thing in, so we all could actually learn what it takes to create a company and transform it. And thank you sort of for creating that movie and sort of helping us understand all the perspective of your journey. And thank you so much. You're always welcome back on the podcast. So if there's so is there any plan for a sequel of this?
I'm not sure that yet. Let me focus on the one book right now, but we'll see. It was my pleasure to
So
be here, and I do look forward to coming back. Right?
awesome.
Okay.
I think thank you so much on that. And whenever you're in Boston, let me know. I love to meet at some point.
I,
And I
that'll be a
think
lot of fun.
personally, thank you so much on your journey and spending your time with us. I do appreciate that.
I appreciate your time. Thank you. Have a great day.
Awesome. You too.
Yeah, I just I thought I was sick of home, but actually I was homesick. Never really knew that I would have to grow up so quick. I'm so uncomfortable, don't know anybody here. Just a couple dudes that I met once, that's it. And I go into the booth feeling nervous. Got butterflies in my stomach like I'm so worthless. Is the mic on? I don't know how to work this. Inside I'm breaking down, I hope I'm not up on the